Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Rochelle Gurstein about her book titled Written in Water, The Ephemeral Life of the Classic in Art, published by Yale University Press in 2024, which takes a look at something that I think, I certainly came to this book going, oh, of course, there must be classics in art, right? Like the white marble statues, and those have been classics for ages. That's why they're in the big fancy museums. You know, everyone goes and sees the Mona Lisa. Turns out, way less true than I had thought. And the actual history of how these things became classics, what the idea of a classic even is, how that's changed over time, is much more interesting than I had thought. So, Rochelle, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to bust a whole bunch of myths and tell us about some interesting history.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Could you please introduce yourself a bit to start us off and tell us about kind of why you decided to write the book and the questions you're asking in them?
Certainly. I started writing this book a long time ago. I was concerned about the culture wars, which of course are still going on, and the question of whether there really was such a thing as a classic, whether canons change over time, and why our arguments, at least in the United States, had become so sterile, interminable, shrill. And I'm a historian of ideas, and I thought perhaps I could address these questions and concerns of mine by writing a book on the question of the classic. Was there such a thing as I was interested in the idea of the timeless universal classic, and I was concerned whether there was a way to actually give support through historical evidence that there were such a thing as a classic, timeless universal classic. As you mentioned in your nice little introduction to my book, what I found shocked me as much as I think it shocked you and other people, that the Mona Lisa was not always regarded as a timeless universal classic, that works of art that we assume, like the Mona Lisa, have always been loved, have not, that works like the Michelangelo's David in Florence, that people, I think, hold in very high regard, were once regarded instead as a kind of his juvenilia. And the work that mattered most to people was the Moses in Rome. I found many, many examples of this kind of thing. And it launched me into a search for where did we get the idea of the timeless universal classic? Was there a way to establish a legitimate standard of taste?
I'm glad I wasn't the only one surprised in starting to look at these things, and, so pleased, therefore, that you've gone and investigated and come up with some answers to these surprises for us. But I'd love to ask, rather than talk about the kind of Mona Lisa that we know now and wasn't as big a deal then, I'd love to almost flip that and ask you to tell us about an example of a piece of art that was a massive deal. I mean, goodness, just reading from the book, I got a sense of just how big a deal this piece of art was, without even, I'm sure you went into I know you went into all the primary sources that made it even more vivid, I'm sure. But we don't know. We've kind of lost the Venus de Medici. How and why could this thing that was at the center of so many books, so many discussions for such a long time, just disappear from the modern imagination? And to what extent is the story of this particular statue and its disappearance kind of an exemplification of this general change that we're talking about and that you've investigated, or is this kind of a special case?
Yes, the Venus de Medici, I'm wondering if most of our listeners know what the statue is. It's located in the Uffizi in Florence, and it was once, as you mentioned, the most beloved, most visited, most written about ancient sculpture. It had the status of, like the Mona Lisa today, or Andy Warhol's Marilyn. It was. Everyone knew it. Everyone wrote about it. When people traveled to Florence, the first thing they wanted to do was to see this sculpture. I came across it quite by accident. I'm not an art historian. I'm a historian of ideas, and I was reading a book many years ago by a man named Kenneth Camille called Democratic Eloquence. In fact, I thought I would actually read a quotation that got my book started. So bear with me as I read this. I think it'll help our viewers. Our listeners understand what we're talking about. Um, I had happened upon a travel essay published in Blackwood's magazine in 1857. It told of a chance meeting between a group of Englishmen and a, quote, Yankee who had just visited what they called Florence the Beautiful. The Englishman reports that one of his companions had addressed the American enthusiastically. Now I'm going to read a relatively long quotation, but this was really the start of my book, and I think it will clue in our listeners to how important this statue once was. So the Englishman says to the Yankee, "Of course, you were in raptures with the Venus de Medici, expecting an answer such as he himself would have given. Well, sir, to tell you the truth, I don't care much about those stone gals," was the answer he received. Our friend collapsed. Had anyone in his presence denied the orthodoxy of St. Augustine or abjured the 39 Articles, there would have been more sorrow in his anger, but scarcely more indignation. The Venus de Medici, a classic chef d'oeuvre, a thing which Praxiteles might have touched with his chisel, or Pericles have looked upon, to be called a stone gal! Exclamation point. Had he doubted its genuineness or spoken of it as a specimen of secondary art, he might have been deemed critical, hypercritical. But this was a classic impiety, an irreverence, a profanity. And it doesn't stop here. The Yankees' words also betrayed, quote, uncivism and egoism. He was undoubtedly among that type who, quote, under their home influences and the shadow of their own nationalities, have no aptitude for general civism. This quotation, at first, I thought was amusing, the idea of the Yankees saying, I don't care much for those stone gals. But the Englishman's response to the Yankee of calling him uncivic and egoistic launched me into my search for the Venus de Medici and to this question of aesthetic judgment. Are there standards? We, of course, I don't think anyone would respond today in this way to say someone is uncivic or egoistic if they don't admire a well-regarded work of art. We would say something more like it's a matter of taste, or they don't have taste, or everyone's entitled to his or her own taste. So this was astonishing to me. And I was also astonished that I had no picture in my mind of the sculpture. I originally wondered, was this really the Venus de Milo, which most of us do know at the Louvre? And somehow the name had changed over time. So I looked in the art history books I had at home, and I couldn't find anything. So this, as I say, launched me on my search for this sculpture. And I found, as we've already remarked, that it was completely well-known, completely beloved from the 16th century when it was first, or the 15th century when it was first discovered in Rome, and until the end of the 19th century. It was imitated by artists. Its praises were sung by poets. Everyone mentioned it in letters when they traveled. So I'm not sure how much I should say at this point about how it lost the status, but this cultural forgetting that I didn't know what the sculpture was, and then it turned out, as I asked art historians, classicists, if they did, that so few of them knew about it. It really disturbed my whole sense of what we regard as the timeless universal classic. If a sculpture that was admired for 400 years could basically vanish into thin air, what did it mean about the lastingness of the idea of a classic?
That's such a useful starting point of the book and, of course, of our discussion as well. So thank you for the quotation and the kind of your response to it when you found it. Like, wait a second, what is going on here? I think I know for a fact that the answer of kind of why did we forget it is much more complicated than a sentence or two. And in fact, it's probably going to take me a few questions to have you talk us through kind of the various pieces of it. So perhaps a place to start would be kind of towards the end of the period of the Venus de Medici being such a big deal, or maybe the beginning of the forgetting, right? Something is happening in this sort of 18th century moment. Can you take us there? What was being discussed at that time in terms of what art was, what history was, and why do you think it was that it was this moment when these discussions were being had?
Yes, it is. That's in fact that's where my book begins, in the 18th century. Though I'm taken back to the Renaissance with the writer Vasari and to classical antiquity. Um, the Venus de Medici, as well as a number of other sculptures that are mostly forgotten today, the Apollo Belvedere, the Laocoon, both of which are in Rome, in the Vatican. These sculptures were regarded from the time of the Renaissance until the 18th and 19th century as exemplars of ideal beauty. These were works of art that any artist, sculptor, painter was instructed to study with deeply, to contemplate, and to use as a model of beauty. The idea here, which comes from Vasari, who writes about them in the Renaissance, um, the ancients had seen in these sculptures ideal nature, and if you were an artist in the 18th century, you had two choices in order to make in your education to acquire the idea of ideal beauty. One would be to look at as many examples of nature as you possibly could and try to form a perfected version. So if you looked at as many roses as you could possibly look at, you would see nature in what was often thought of as its deformed form. It's what happens when it exists in reality. They wouldn't have used the term reality, but it exists in nature. The people who had this idea of ideal beauty believed instead that you should take from each example and try to imagine what it would look like if it were perfected. A shortcut, as many people would say, to this very long process of trying to distinguish ideal beauty would be to imitate the Venus de Medici, the Apollo Belvedere, because those sculptures had already done this purification of nature and had come up with these ideal forms. So these sculptures were held up as exemplars. And one of the writers I look at in great detail is Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was the first president of the Royal Academy in England. And he said, what I just summarized, I learned from him. So these sculptures were used, the idea of exemplar was actually a synonym for the idea of a classic. Classic, ideal beauty, exemplar, these were all synonyms in ways that I think is very alien to our thought. And the more recent artists who were held up as exemplars were Raphael and Michelangelo, who had seen these sculptures, these ancient sculptures, and had imitated them. This comes from Vasari's Lives of the Artists. This understanding of art that you should imitate exemplars was long held from the Renaissance until the 18th century, when painters and sculptors began running into trouble. The works that they were making started looking artificial. Affected was the word that was often used about them, to their own eyes and to their viewers. So this was one of the troubles that artists and viewers were running into with the old practice of art in the 18th century. Another thing I wanted to say here was the 18th century is also the beginning of modern philosophy and the philosophical discipline of aesthetics. And well-known philosophers, who became well-known, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, were asking questions about what is the nature of beauty, what is the nature of taste. I originally went to those writers before I discovered Sir Joshua Reynolds, and found that they also had these exemplars in mind, but they were not talking about the practice of art as such. They were talking about questions of what is the nature of beauty, what is the nature of taste. I found Reynolds a much more fruitful source, because he was speaking, he delivered lectures yearly to students of the Royal Academy, and he was trying to figure out, or to teach them the principles of art as he best knew them from studying ancients and Raphael and Michelangelo. So I think there was a sort of crisis in the 18th century about the nature, as I mentioned, the philosophers asking the nature of beauty, the nature of taste, and actual practitioners of painting and sculpture who were finding the old exemplars were beginning to fail them, that they were not making paintings that could compete with Raphael and Michelangelo.
On that last point, why was that such a crisis? Why was that a competition that was kind of still so relevant? Like, why was it seen as such a failure that their works weren't like the exemplars?
Again, this was very alien to me, living as a modern person in our world, where originality and creativity are held in such high regard. Those ideas about originality and creativity turned out to be much later historical developments, which, again, my book was filled with surprises for me. I was always startled by what I was finding. One of two things come to mind in regard to what you just asked, and these were, again, discoveries that surprised me. I began to realize that in the 18th century, um, writers and artists and people in general did not have a strong historical sense in the way that we do. They didn't think of the past as that different from the present, and they didn't imagine the future to be so different from the past and the present. And so people like Reynolds, when he was instructing artists to the principles of their art, he would say to them, you need to study Raphael and Michelangelo, have them in mind when you make your work, because they are he didn't call them your contemporaries, but he said they're your rivals, whom you need to be able to, since they are the greatest exemplars of beauty and excellence. If you're going to be a great artist, you need to be able to rival, perhaps surpass them. This is a moment before there was an idea of progress in the arts, which was also a surprise to me. That's really a 19th century idea, as is the idea of progress in general. The idea about the relationship to the past was that you were pretty much contemporaneous with the greats of the past. And there was no sense also with no historical sense, there was also no sense of tradition. I found that Reynolds and other writers, whether it's Edmund Burke, who was a friend of his, or Samuel Johnson, another great friend of his, that they don't use the word tradition in the way that we do. It meant something a bit more trivial. It was the oral stories passed down about different writers and artists. So it was used in the plural of, I have traditions to tell you about such and such an artist or writer or historian. And that the people, I came to understand that because people didn't have a sense that the past was different from the present, they were in the tradition as a living membership. They didn't stand outside of it the way we do, or were able to disown it the way moderns are. So this was, again, a surprise, both about the practice of art and this reliance on exemplars as the classic, as well as this lack of a modern historical sense, that there was no idea that you would judge the past in its own terms, which I discovered as a 19th century idea. So all of this was quite disorienting to me, because I had read secondary literature, often quite wonderful books, that would describe the 18th century using what turned out to be anachronistic terms about traditional or tradition or classical tradition. None of these words were in use the way we use them in the 18th century. It was really like learning I wouldn't say a foreign language, because I was reading many English sources, but I had to really open my mind to the way they used language and not assume that they used the words the way we do.
Yeah, honestly, in some ways, it feels more complicated than learning a foreign language because you do think you know what it means, and then you're like, wait a second, that's actually really, really different. So yeah, I had a very similar experience reading the book of like, oh, okay, that is not where my brain immediately went. All right then. So obviously something has changed between then and now. One of the factors is, as you mentioned, this kind of crisis. Another one you discuss in the book is the Elgin Marbles coming to England, which is obviously still a piece of art, at least in the UK, that is well known for its political controversy, perhaps more than its art. But you talk in the book that this is a key moment as well in this kind of change that we're talking about, but for very different reasons than we might still be discussing this piece now. So why was this significant in these debates?
The Elgin Marbles came to England in around, I think it was 1806 or 1807. Elgin, or I think his name perhaps is pronounced Elgin, was an ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And he, as this has become a dispute in our day, as we all know, a very large dispute about excuse me, who really the marbles belong to, whether it's the English or the Greek. But at the time when Elgin acquired the marbles, Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire, and this is during the Napoleonic Wars. So it's a very different context. I don't think I'll go into a lot of detail about that. But in any case, Elgin had received permission to take what he wanted from the Acropolis in Athens, pretty much as a token of goodwill, because, again, this is a kind of complicated history, because of the English help in defeating the French in that area, that geographical area during the Napoleonic Wars. It's much more complicated, but I'll let it rest there. When he brought them to England, he wanted to display them, or he had them on display for visitors to see. He had originally acquired them with the hope of bringing the true relics of antiquity to England to help English artists educate their eye to ideal beauty. What was quite startling to virtually everyone who saw them is they did not live up to the ideal beauty of sculptures like the Venus de Medici or the Apollo Belvedere. Those sculptures had been fully restored, polished, and were complete. As anyone knows who has seen the Elgin Marbles at the British Museum, those marbles were not restored. This was the first time ever that someone had bought marbles and had not restored them. He actually, or Elgin's representatives, had approached the most famous artists of the time, the sculptors of the time, most famous being Canova, and an Italian sculptor, and he refused to restore them, saying he would not commit sacrilege by touching them with a chisel. So people had a new idea about what these sculptures were. But because they were not restored, they didn't look at all like what people who were accustomed to seeing the sculptures that were restored and were beloved, they didn't look like that. So one thing was they were not restored, which disturbed some viewers. But the other thing which shocked artists and sculptors and viewers and connoisseurs was that they had details that went against the notion of ideal beauty. One sculptor responded by saying, "My God," he didn't say "my God," he said, "the gods have veins." There was this sense that before that time, they'd never seen any kind of detail, anatomical and muscular detail. It was all the Roman sculptures were very much smoothed over. So this was a startling development in looking at works of art, that the way it was described were that these sculptures had ideal beauty and the details of nature, which before this time were thought to be an impossible combination. This when I was first reading about this, there's a wonderful source, which is the actual hearings in 1816 when the House of Commons interviewed artists and connoisseurs and people who knew a great deal about antiquities to see whether the government should buy the sculptures or not. So there's actual testimony given that's quite rich and extraordinary about what the artists and connoisseurs were seeing. I had imagined wrongly that this would lead to a demotion of the old favorites because now they had for the first times the true relics of antiquity before them. It didn't. I mean, for a number of people, there's a very famous sculptor at the time, Flaxman. He continued to hold in higher regard um, the Apollo Belvedere, for example, because it was a god of a higher order than some of the Elgin Marbles, as well as because it was restored and it was complete. So there was an appreciation by almost all of the artists of how supreme the Elgin marbles or the marbles from the Parthenon were, but it didn't lead to an automatic demotion of the old favorites. They continued to be, excuse me, loved, copied, imitated, but they had these new exemplars as well. So it was opening up a competing standard of beauty, of ideal nature with the details of actual nature. But it didn't lead to any sense that you wouldn't admire the old sculptures. I should say, and this surprised me, another one of these surprises, very few people had seen any Greek, what we think of as authentic Greek art from the 4th and 5th century BC, because the Ottoman Empire was largely closed off to Western travelers. When people took the Grand Tour, it was really Florence and Rome that were their destinations. Almost no one until the 19th century was traveling to Greece very often. So these sculptures were simply unknown to the larger public. Their fame spread very quickly. Writers like Goethe spoke about wanting to visit them. He never had, saying that you wouldn't need to go anywhere else. You would just go to England after that point to see them. They had a huge impact on viewers. But as I say, it didn't demote the old favorites, which surprised me. That would take basically the whole 20th century, the entire 19th century before they would start losing their status, primarily as when they were beginning to be thought of as Roman copies of missing Greek originals, a distinction that had meant nothing to anyone before really the middle of the 19th and finally at the close of the 19th century. But even when they're seeing the Elgin marbles, there's some awareness that there's multiple versions of the Venus de Medici, but nobody says we shouldn't continue to adore the sculpture. That distinction, copy and original, Greek and Roman, that's so central to our distinctions today about ancient sculpture, meant virtually nothing to connoisseurs and artists.
Is the idea of the genius or the romantic genius even part of what explains that change?
One would think it would, right? I mean, that would be something that would tie into creativity and originality. And I come from a background more of literature than art. Excuse me. In my undergraduate days, I was actually an English major. I became a historian later in my life. And I had read a book that made a huge impression on me by M.H. Abrams called The Mirror and the Lamp, which I'm sure many of our listeners know, which is a wonderful book about changing ideas of the genius of the maker and of the aims of art. But it's in poetry, not in visual art. And one of the things, this was in my mind as a prejudice when I was reading these sources that were new to me, one of the things I kept looking for was this development that Abrams had traced in Romantic poetry, which was the movement from poetry as a mirror to nature, moving away from that to the idea of the poet and poetry as a expression, um, the lamp as an expression of the poet, the idea that we have much more of as the creative genius. I expected, because we hear a great deal about romantic versus classic in debates about French art, the idea of Delacroix versus Ingres, Delacroix being the romantic, Ingres being the classic, that I would find a similar development about romantic genius and about that movement from the mirror of holding up art or poetry as the mirror to nature, imitation of nature, and the movement towards a kind of lamp of experience, the lamp of the inner state of the poet or artist. Again, much to my surprise, I did not find that. I found instead, in the case of an artist who's no longer known at all today, Benjamin Robert Haydon, a British artist who had wanted to be a great history painter, to be the successor of Raphael. He would sleep under Raphael's portrait. He tried to imitate him in every possible way he could. I'm speaking about a painter who lived in the first part of the 19th century, had been a Royal Academy student, and devoted his life to making history paintings in England. He, at the time, was a great failure, partly, I think, because when we look at the few paintings that still exist, sadly, they're not tremendously good. But also, the taste was already changing. In England, there was a great taste for portraiture and still life. And he was convinced, partly because of the purchase of the Elgin Marbles, that the English government should be giving more support to artists to make great public paintings of the scale of Raphael and Michelangelo. In the 1830s, as your English listeners will know, the Parliament had burned and they were going to rebuild it. And in fact, there was a big, and I knew nothing about this, a big competition that was held for frescoes that were going to adorn the Parliament buildings, the interiors. And Haydon was very much involved in trying to get a commission. And in any case, he kept diaries and journals that were published after he died in the 1850s. He ended up committing suicide. His diaries and journals were well received by the public as a portrait of the unrecognized genius. And this surprised me because I had been imagining that the Romantic genius would be making art more like the way the Impressionists made art, or Dadaists later would make art, that this would be someone who's unappreciated because the works of art are so startling to the viewers. But in this case, again, quite surprising to me, he was making art that was looking backwards to the great history paintings of Raphael and Michelangelo based on the ancients, and was not being appreciated not because of a forward-looking vision, but because of a backward-looking, what we would call a backward-looking vision. But he had all the earmarks of the Romantic genius. And in books where there's excerpts of some of his diaries in various readers of the 19th century about Romantic versus classic. And he's pictured as a Romantic genius because of his feelings that he's being ignored, that he is underappreciated. And in fact, tragically, he commits suicide because the public in the end does reject yet another painting he's making. And he writes to the very end. He's quite a wonderful writer. He writes to the very end about what he's feeling. So he has the disposition of what we think of as the Romantic genius, but in the name of work that is actually very traditional. That's not quite the right word, because at the time they wouldn't have said that. But his desire, as I said, was to be the new Raphael, the next Raphael, to bring glory to England. And instead, he found himself impoverished. He had been arrested a number of times. He'd been in debtor prison. He's a tragic figure. I don't mean to. I sort of laughed when I said that. Reading his story is one that's quite harrowing. He's an excellent writer, and I think, as I say, he committed suicide in the 1850s. He was well known enough that there was a hearing that was covered in all the newspapers about what caused him to commit suicide. Was he a genius, or was he suffering from some kind of brain fever, as they called it? So he had a kind of, I guess, notoriety is one way of thinking of it. But he was well loved by many of the most famous people at the time. And it's this case of what the romantic genius was completely surprised me. And his heroes that come up in his journals primarily are not artists. They're people like Napoleon. He pictures himself as a kind of Napoleonic figure of art, that he's going to be. I can't think of the word he used. He's going to show the world that he doesn't care what they think, that he will be brave and courageous and bring art back to life in a way that the English hadn't seen for years. So that's one example of a romantic genius that emerges in a context very different from what most of us, I think, have come to expect.
Yeah, that's definitely very different. And also, as that particular example demonstrates, the stakes here are really high, or perceived as being really high, in a way that feels a bit different from what you were telling us about kind of the earlier period. Why was this sort of 19th century moment talking about these ideas around art, around history, around taste in like such a existential, high stakes kind of way?
Yes, it's again, this too surprised me. I think most moderns who have a great love or passion for art and poetry and fiction put a great deal of we find great meaning in works of art and works of literature. I was surprised to find that even that is, as you mentioned, a kind of 19th century sensibility. That in the 18th century, art or painting, David Hume once said something to the effect of, we go to paintings as we go to conversation, for cultivation, sociability, refinement. There's nothing about existential questions of the sort that we now, I think, feel we experience in works of art and literature today, or beginning in the 19th and 20th century. It was a surprise to me. There's a couple of different developments, I think, that address this. One of them, earlier I was talking about, and you had mentioned how often these works of art that we believe are classics end up having a more recent lineage in their high status. Another development I found was the idea of rediscoveries of works of art that many of us love today, that I think we assume have always been long loved. In fact, are relatively recent tastes as well. Something I spend a lot of time in my book thinking about is the rediscovery of what we call, or at the time was called, the early Christian painters. These are artists like Cimabue, Giotto, Fra Angelico, Piero della Francesca, painters that I think many people today, when they go to Italy, want to see more than they want to see Raphael or Michelangelo or Leonardo. They're the artists who were before them. in the 19th century, there are, as I'm sure your listeners know, there were, especially in the first half of the 19th century, there were many religious revivals. In the United States, there was evangelical revivals, and in France, there was a Catholic revival. In England, there's the Oxford movement, and the people who, and in Germany as well, there's a kind of Catholic revivalism. There's a feeling among some artists that these earlier artists, whom I mentioned, the early Christian painters, address a kind of religious expression and piety and have deep emotional resonances that the beautiful works of the high Renaissance, Raphael, Michelangelo, Titian, Veronese, Tintoretto, you name it, that they don't have. And at the same time that artists are having more difficulty imitating the ancients, this is, I think, just coincidentally, there seems to be a yearning on the part of a number of viewers for a more intense experience with art that has to do with religious yearnings, with Christian yearnings. There's a number, the person who's most associated with this is John Ruskin, who's quite famous for his writings on art as well as his social criticism. I had assumed that Ruskin, in his he has 5 volumes of a masterpiece on art called Modern Painters, that Ruskin was responsible for this love of the early Christian painters. It turns out not only, of course, are works of art forgotten, but authors are forgotten. There was a French writer named A.F. Rio, R-I-O, who had written a book called The Poetry of Christian Art in, I guess it was the 1840s. It's not translated into English until the 1850s. But this makes a huge impression on readers in England and in France and elsewhere. And he basically challenges the story of the high Renaissance, of the progress of the growing perfection of art that the famous Vasari had written, and begins to tell a counter history of Christian painting. And this gives viewers a new feeling about what art can do. When you read people like Ruskin, who's a very expressive, beautiful writer, he speaks of this work in ways that has very little to do with beauty, which had been the aesthetic response people had before. And instead it becomes a kind of spiritual awakening and enlivening, deepening. And I couldn't find this way of writing about art before this time. I think in some ways it's associated with what we think of as romanticism, but it grows up in a different linguistic universe, to use a kind of abstract term. But it's people who are looking to art for deep emotional experience. There's many complications with this. I don't know how much I should say about it right now, but this is also growing up in a moment where different writers are thinking about the zeitgeist thinking, the spirit of the age. And there's a question being raised by certain people who adore the Christian painters. A writer named Anna Jameson, who's been largely forgotten, also writes at length about them, whether if artists imitate these new exemplars, they imitate Giotto, for example, or Fra Angelico, will their work speak to the spirit of the 19th century? So this is a growing historical sense at the same time as is a growing deep desire for a more intense experience from art than from what people are getting from looking at either the old masters or their contemporaries like Haydn or even Delacroix or Géricault, who are in the same period. I'm not sure if that quite had, I think I might have gotten off track a little with the question you asked, but those are some of the currents that are shifting in the 19th century, a sense of a desire for a more intense experience with art that goes with this religious revivalism, a new sense of a spirit of the age, that art somehow has to speak to the concerns of its moment. And this is, I should have brought this up earlier, this also leads sort of unintentionally to the demotion of classical art, of ancient sculpture, of the Renaissance, as being, especially the classical sculpture, as being pagan. That classic becomes a spirit of the age term, meaning pagan religion, as opposed to this kind of love and purity of these Christian painters. And classical becomes something demeaned by the Christians, the people who love the Christian art, as lesser. It's pagan, and that pagan art might be beautiful, but it could never be as deep, they would say, as the art that was made for Christian expression.
This is very helpful to map out, as you said, the currents, because as you were talking through the multiple pieces there, some of this is starting to sound a bit more familiar to where we are now, right? We're starting to take those steps to, away from the surprise and towards what we have now. And that's kind of very much the direction I'd like us to continue discussing. So building on those currents, what then takes us to these ideas that we have now around sort of universality, around timelessness, around that being what a classic means? And what does this have to do? Is the next step the development of formalism, or are there other kind of next steps we need to understand?
Yes, I wrote this book and thought about these questions for many, many, many years. And at a certain point, when I was getting towards the end of the 19th century in the book, I realized, again, as a surprise, that the people I had been reading their work, that they didn't use words like universality and timelessness, that the classic had the notion, as I mentioned before, of being an exemplar. Classic had acquired the notion of being somehow related to eternity through the idea of ideal beauty and general nature. Classic had ideas about being the opposite of romantic, but the idea that was so central to me, and was in dispute in our own times about classics and canons and standards, was the idea that the classic was somehow timeless and universal. And I have to say, when I began my book, I had hoped I would be able to demonstrate that there were actual works of art that were timeless and universal, and that there was a standard of art. And I would do this by writing the history of these terms. As is clear, history let me down. It wouldn't allow me to write that story. It wasn't true. So I didn't find talk of timelessness and universality really until the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. And the writers who I think give us our vocabulary of aesthetic autonomy, which is very much related to this idea of formalism, the writers in English are Bernard Berenson and Roger Fry. Roger Fry, I felt, was the more important of the two, though I treat both of them. One of the things that I had mentioned before about the 19th century not having historical sense or a sense of tradition, something I had seen in my book were what people like Alasdair MacIntyre speak about as paradigm shifts. And paradigm shifts occur, I believe, when artists are not able to push their practice into the future, that their work starts to feel exhausted to themselves, which is something I had mentioned before. As anyone listening to this, our conversation knows, modern art introduced something quite radical into the world. I'm speaking specifically, I have in mind Cezanne, who was a very important modern artist. Roger Fry, who's English, put on he also himself was a painter, a writer and a painter, and he arranged an exhibition of what he called post-impressionist art in England, in London, in 1910 and 1912. The term post-impressionism was a term he invented, and in those shows, he had works by Manet, but also Cezanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Picasso, all the modern artists who we regard as the founders of modernism. He was making an argument. He doesn't use the word paradigm shift, but there had been a great change in what artists were doing. Instead of imitating nature, they were now producing a different picture of reality that would be self-contained within the picture plane of the painting. The old exemplars meant nothing to these artists, as we all know who from looking at these works. They don't have perspective. They're flat. They have color that isn't necessarily local to the color that you would imagine the sky or the ground would be. And this shocked many viewers at the time. I've come to believe in reading Fry and Berenson and people of the time that they had become increasingly alienated from the tradition of classical humanist thought. They are not Christian, but yet they still have paintings. They have the current paintings, their contemporary paintings that they admire and are trying to open the eyes of viewers to appreciate. But at the same time, someone like Fry actually still admires Raphael. So I began to realize that there's still the old favorites in the world, and these cultivated viewers like Fry still have an attachment to them. When he's writing about the two terms that many of us associate with aesthetic autonomy, which is another form of the timeless universal classic, when he's writing about that question, what is an exemplar of that, he gives as an example the last painting Raphael ever made in his life, which is the Transfiguration. And he says this painting was very beloved, and today, and from the last 20 years, very few people care at all about it. And he begins to ask why this is the question. He asks the question, why people no longer appreciate this work. And he says it's because of they no longer know the Christian story, and also that the figures look artificial. I think he uses the word gesticulating. They're false. It's hard to describe what the painting is about. I would say it's better for people to just try to find it in a book, or to, if they don't know it, or to look at it online, the Transfiguration. Anyway, instead of trying to tell people what the story is, or why Raphael was long beloved, he begins to make a formal analysis of the painting, and describes it in terms of the way the painting is composed. And he describes it ultimately as an example of significant form. And he says that it is it's superior to trying to make a narrative. The history of paintings had always been stories of the Bible or classical myths. He's saying those things are somehow lesser, that literature can provide those kinds of stories, that art should be aesthetic, autonomous, create its own reality. He's a great admirer, as I mentioned, of post-impressionists, especially Cezanne. He also is a great admirer of what at the time was called primitivisms, not only the early Christian painters who are called primitive, meaning first. It's not meant as any kind of derogatory term, but also he writes about African sculpture. He writes about pre-Columbian art. He writes about Islamic art, Japanese and Chinese paintings. And all of these things he speaks about in terms of their significant form. He goes to say, as does Berenson, you do not need to know anything about the artist, the practice of the art, the country, the culture, the history of that country or culture and the practices. All you need to do is look at the work and see its formal qualities. And this, he takes it. It's, to me, I began to understand formalism as an alienation from these earlier traditions of humanism, Christian stories, classical tradition, the religious traditions, and it becomes a new way of looking at works that he, Fry, and other people in Bloomsbury groups, as well as cultivated people everywhere, begin to think is a deeper, more intense experience with art because it's aesthetic on its own. You don't need to know anything about the work of art. That's what would make it timeless and universal. I had no idea when I first started this book that timelessness and universality would be so tied to filling the void left by the waning of the love of the Venus de Medici and that whole past. But it was a new way that of seeing art that emerged both with modernism and rediscoveries, I guess would be the best word, of these non-Western works of art, which leads to a complete reordering of the canon in a way I think that's even more radical than earlier ones, or even the disputes we have today about social justice and which artists should be part of the canon and which should be excluded. This moment is a complete reordering of the canon of aesthetic experience, of the foundations of aesthetic experience, of what art really can be and might be. So I was, again, I keep using the word astonished, but I was once again caught up short with what I thought was going on with the history of art and what I actually found in reading the sources.
Well, and I'm so pleased you've shared that with us, obviously here in abbreviated form as compared to the book. But it is just so fascinating to understand kind of what we have now as being how radical it is, how big a departure it is, given how much it is that we take these things for granted. You know, we're debating all sorts of things about art at the moment, but not this. And we are taking it as timeless in a way that, as you've demonstrated, it really isn't.
Yes.
So thank you for taking us on this journey with you. And I'm pleased to hear that kind of you were as surprised as I was in reading it. It's really quite an interesting experience to go through. So I definitely recommend readers who are interested in this to get into the details we're not able to cover here. But before I let them go off and begin that journey, I wonder, as a final question to you, Rochelle, if you might have an idea of a next project, or if there's spin-offs from this project, or anything else about your work beyond this book that you'd like to preview or highlight.
I, in writing this book, had, before it took this form, I had written a number of essays about aesthetic versus extra aesthetic questions when it comes to judgments of art, questions that come up in relation to fakes, or to whether authenticity on about music, whether music should be played on old instruments or our modern ones, in the case of Bach, for example. Restorations, what are we looking at when we're looking at a restored work of art or building? These questions recast some of the things I've been describing, I think from a more existential perspective. And I'm hoping, I had originally thought I was going to call this book Of Time and Beauty. And this collection of essays that I'm thinking, I've written some of them, but I'm going to be rewriting and adding to them, I think will go deeper into those questions of which things belong to time and which things are, I guess, preserved from time when we call them beautiful. So that's a vague answer to the question of what I'm going to be doing next.
But an interesting one. So best of luck in kind of whatever direction that takes you. And of course, in the meantime, listeners can read the book we've been talking about, titled Written in Water, The Ephemeral Life of the Classic and Art, published by Yale University Press in 2024. Rochelle, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us about your book.
And thank you so much for having me, Miranda. I really appreciate it.